Tonight with Peter Jennings.
Good evening. We begin tonight with a measure of confusion in the Persian Gulf. President Bush called Saddam Hussein a little Hitler again today and said that never can be any compromise with his kind of aggression. But from Saudi Arabia hints that some members of the ruling family there may be increasingly anxious about the prospect of war and may be looking for a deal with Iraq to avoid it. Our first report is from our national security correspondent, John McWethy.
The controversy began Sunday when Saudi Defense Minister Sultan held a press conference. He appeared to be hinting that Saudi Arabia would not be opposed if Kuwait made concessions to Iraq, even handing over Kuwaiti territory once Saddam Hussein agreed to withdraw his troops. Sultan said Saudi Arabia in general advocates making, quote, brotherly Arab concessions if they are done with dignity. He said, quote, there is no harm done to any Arab country by giving some of its land, money, or a sea outlet to another sister Arab country. Those comments created an immediate sensation. Adding to the speculation that a deal was in the works, Egyptian President Mubarak made a surprise visit to Saudi Arabia yesterday to meet with King Fahad. But today, Saudi Arabia's ambassador to Washington, Prince Bandar, was saying it was all a mistake, that the press was trying to make this into a new Saudi peace initiative when, in fact, Saudi Arabia's position had not changed at all.
Saudi Arabia has not suggested that there should be concessions made by Kuwait to anybody. That's one is not our right, nor was it what was said.
Amid all the speculation, President Bush today, out campaigning, underscored his adamant opposition to any concession.
I must tell you that I am more determined than ever to see that this invading dictator gets out of Kuwait with no compromise of any kind whatsoever.
But some American officials believe the Saudis were trying to signal Saddam Hussein. If he would commit to pulling his troops out of Kuwait, he could not only avoid a war with the U.S., but could also get some of the Kuwaiti territory he was seeking in the first place. John McWethy, ABC News, the State Department.
To talk a little more about this, joining us in our Washington bureau is Jim Akins, the former U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia, one of the Americans who knows the Saudis very well. Do you think that the Saudis may be actively reconsidering their position because they have come to the conclusion that a war might actually be fought in Saudi Arabia, not just in Kuwait and Iraq?
No, I don't think so. I don't think there's going to be a war inside Saudi Arabia. The missiles can hit Saudi Arabia, true, but if the war is fought, it's going to be in Kuwait and Iraq. But I think they are very carefully considering the consequences of such a war. The fact that the United States almost certainly would be isolated in this war. The Egyptians and the Syrians have already said that they will not participate in any attack on Iraq. And Saudi Arabia would be very, very uncomfortable in that case.
So why all this flurry of publicity today? Why these headlines all over the world based on the mere mention of negotiations by the Saudi defense minister?
Well, because it's very important. He's talking about a way out of the crisis. He's talking about giving Saddam Hussein something that everybody in the world knows Saddam Hussein wants. But obviously, you've got to withdraw from Kuwait first before we consider these nice things.
Is it still your view that King Fahd of Saudi Arabia's line in the sand and George Bush's line in the sand are in the same place?
Absolutely.
Move the hand a little closer to war, a little farther to war, or in the same place as a result of what we've been seeing in the last couple of days?
We're clearly farther from war.
Clearly farther away from war.
Clearly.
Mr. Aiken, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Now the news from the Gulf. The Iraqi government announced today that all 330 French citizens being held against their will may go home. The government gave no reason. France said the release would be good news for those families, but said that taking hostages is abhorrent and called on Saddam Hussein to release all the foreign nationals. In the Jordanian capital Amman today, a plane from Baghdad brought out 14 Americans and more than 30 British citizens. A few students, most of the rest either elderly or people in need of medical attention. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Colin Powell, reviewed the troops in Saudi Arabia today. He said Iraqi forces remain solidly entrenched in Kuwait and show no signs of pulling back. For Saudi Arabia, the confrontation has had an embarrassing side effect. They are making enormous amounts of money because they are pumping out an enormous amount of oil at very high prices. Here's ABC's Jim Hickey.
Saudi Arabia has reached its capacity, pumping nearly 8 million barrels of oil a day, about 3 million more than when the Gulf conflict began. At today's prices, that means the kingdom is earning an extra $80 million a day. It is something they are not eager to talk about. Saudi Arabians are especially sensitive that they might appear to be making a huge windfall oil profit from the Gulf crisis. That, they will tell you, is simply not true.
Definitely, we're making a lot of money, but we're spending it at the same time.
In fact, little of it has been spent so far. But Saudi Arabia has promised to pay $12 billion a year for U.S. and other combat forces here, as well as for aid to such allies as Egypt and Turkey. Another $4 billion is committed to Kuwaiti refugees. Even so, the first thing the Saudis have done is to eliminate their own budget deficit. But, they say, that is only a short-term benefit.
While we got rid of $6 billion deficit, we're looking forward for a spending of at least $50 billion that we did not think about before the crisis. It did not exist before the crisis.
The Saudis also note that by pumping oil to make up for lost supplies from Iraq and Kuwait, they are keeping world oil prices from climbing even higher. Until the crisis ends, they will continue to do that and continue to make huge profits. Jim Hickey, ABC News, Saudi Arabia.
In Iraq today, gas rationing began. Iraq is overflowing with crude oil, but because of the embargo, doesn't have the additives it needs to refine it into gasoline. Still in the Middle East, the government of Israel has now completely sealed off the occupied West Bank and the Gaza Strip regions. That means Palestinians living in the territories are not being allowed to enter Israel proper. This follows another day of violence in which one Palestinian was shot to death by Israeli civilians, and at least 4 Israelis were attacked by Palestinians. In a moment, a new report on drug trafficking and professional football. On the American agenda tonight, the economy in 2 parts of the country, one in recession, the other booming. And Humphrey the wayward whale again. He's back in Northern California.
This is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. Brought to you by Ford and your Ford dealer.